In the last two Formula One races, Ferrari has not been up to the level of its direct rivals in qualifying. Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc were forced into comeback races, penalized by the dirty air which, according to them, significantly compromises the performance of the SF-25. Trying to interpret what happened, it seems that beyond the setup choices, the Maranello car fails to adequately prepare the tires. So let's take a quick look at the importance of the warm-up process. This phase is now increasingly refined by every team, thanks to the work of engineers who deal with pure performance, whose task is to instruct the drivers as best as possible, with every small detail that can contribute to a decisive factor in the most important category of motorsport: optimizing tire management over the race weekend. The goal is to bring the tire to the ideal temperature already at the beginning of the flying lap, while at the same time trying to limit overheating during the push lap. To explain better, the engineers must find a perfect balance, dictated mainly by the overall health of the car. If the working window is narrow, as is the case with Ferrari, the driver's approach must be more conservative. It must also be said that in this generation of cars, the tires play a crucial role much more than in the recent past. One of McLaren's great advantages lies precisely in this distinctive trait, being able to manage the tires like no other team. This applies to qualifying but also over the 300-kilometer race distance with a heavy fuel load. To deepen the analysis, we rely on the data, the only real thermometer alongside onboard footage, from which information about the driver's performance can be drawn. We start by comparing the tire preparation of the Ferrari drivers with the two drivers who were strongest in qualifying, Max Verstappen and Oscar Piastri. To do this, we observe telemetry and understand what happens before the flying lap in Q3. Obviously, as one might imagine, the cleanliness of the outlap can also be determined by the level of traffic on the track. In this case, the Saudi Arabian track is certainly not the worst circuit to manage traffic, but on other tracks, this situation becomes more complicated. Consequently, it is up to the driver to be able to carry out a preparation lap correctly, as predetermined in meetings with the engineers. From the comparison, it emerges that Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc seek a lower overall amount of energy compared to Max Verstappen. We can easily understand this by observing the mid-corner speeds, especially for the 7-time F1 world champion, where his speed trace is practically the lowest for almost the entire lap when compared with the other drivers. The reason is linked to the static angles imposed by Ferrari engineers on the tires of the SF-25 single-seater. These, being more aggressive, require lower cornering speeds to transfer energy into the tires. Moreover, the narrower operating window with which the Maranello team is forced to work compels the drivers to a more cautious attitude in tire warm-up, even compared to what Oscar Piastri does. Being less aggressive in the preparation lap almost inevitably leads to a tire not in ideal condition at the beginning of the flying lap. It is important to remember that the target temperature for tire performance is that of the bulk, meaning the metal layer located under the tread. Red Bull and McLaren start the lap with this value very close to the ideal one, while still limiting overheating in the push lap. Often the various methods to heat the tire do so only superficially. The key is to activate it in the bulk area. Managing these two different portions of the tire requires different timing and methods, which often conflict. The Ferrari drivers remain conservative at the start of the lap in order to avoid excessive overheating in the final corners. This problem is also reflected in Charles Leclerc's statements following the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, as the Monegasque driver highlighted the lack of aerodynamic load in qualifying. To achieve a similar level of grip to their rivals, the Ferrari drivers are forced to use a higher average slip angle in corners. This increases the internal tire temperature, significantly limiting the SF-25 car's performance. Heating the bulk becomes complicated, while the surface temperature rises more rapidly. But as mentioned, it must also be kept under control to avoid suffering from an unfavorable condition. That is why Ferrari exploits optimal grip only in limited portions of the lap. Also for this reason, at the 6.174-kilometer Jeddah-Corniche circuit, the SF-25 lost time in the first chicane, while in the race, on average, it produced better results. Ferrari must do better. After the first 5 races of the 2025 F1 season, the balance of power among the top teams is beginning to take shape. McLaren confirms itself as extremely competitive and consistent in results. It undoubtedly has the most high-performing car, and the average of 36 points per race is proof of a well-balanced, efficient, and consistent car. Mercedes, after the first two races where it had positioned itself as the second force. However, after 5 rounds, it has stabilized as the third force, securing 18 points 3 times in a row. Solidity is certainly a strength of the W16, which still has potential to unleash. The Brackley team can rely on a George Russell in top form. Alongside him is a rapidly growing Kimi Antonelli, who has proven to be far from a rookie. Red Bull is relying exclusively on its star driver Max Verstappen, who always manages to extract the maximum from the car, especially in qualifying. The average of 16.60 points per race reflects an inconsistent performance, with positive peaks, such as in Suzuka, alternating with much more difficult races, like in Bahrain. However, the most complicated situation is certainly that of Ferrari. The Maranello team has collected an average of 13.20 points per race, but this figure does not tell the whole story. After a disastrous start between Melbourne and Shanghai, excluding the sprint race, a trend reversal is noticeable starting from Suzuka, with clear growth continuing in Bahrain and Jeddah. In the last 3 Grands Prix, in fact, the Scuderia has achieved an average of 20.33 points per Grand Prix. We are talking about the team that, after the Super McLaren, has scored the most points in this time span. The merit seems to be twofold. On one hand, a small help from the floor, which slowly and progressively, starting from Sakir, has provided a bit more stability to the SF-25. The understeering behavior remains, but it is no longer as invasive as in the first 3 races of the 2025 Formula One season. The other predominant factor concerns Charles Leclerc's ability, skillful in using a particular driving style to match the needs of the new car. The Monegasque, often struggling to find confidence with the balance in the first 3 rounds, began to shape himself around the Maranello car, changing his approach in braking and corner entry phases with his F1 car. This maturation is clearly reflected in the results. If from the opening Grand Prix in Melbourne to the Japanese race in Shanghai, his driving was clumsy and ineffective. In the last 2 races, the Monegasque has appeared much more solid and consistent, able to bring the car into a range not yet optimal but definitely more productive. Awaiting the next aerodynamic update package, this is the best that can be done. But Ferrari's overall approach is improving. From a strategic and operational point of view, the prancing horse seems to have made a qualitative leap. The pit stops are among the most competitive on the grid, as Charles Leclerc himself pointed out at the end of the Jeddah race. Tactical choices also seemed more reactive and less conservative compared to the past, where communication between pit wall and drivers appears more fluid. In recent radio communications, Charles Leclerc seemed much more relaxed in talking with his race engineer Brian Bozzi, all signs that suggest a more cohesive and aware Ferrari, knowing that things can and are slowly improving. The Maranello team is pushing as hard as possible to always be ready to seize every opportunity, an aspect that must remain for the rest of the season. Of course, the gap in pace compared to McLaren remains about 0.3 seconds per lap. A lot of consistency is needed to get back into the fight at the top, but the trend of the last 3 races shows positive signs. Naturally, Lewis Hamilton's contribution is also necessary. The Briton must soon find the same feeling his teammate shows, while waiting for the team to update the SF-25.